Yeah, well, the sanctions were put into place against Iraq in August of 1990 after Iraq invaded Kuwait. Uh, and I suppose that, the first thing that should be said is that without defending the invasion of Kuwait, one should never defend any invasion. Uh, Certainly the United States treated the invasion of Kuwait in a different way than it has treated other invasions. There was something special about the invasion of Kuwait. I mean, the United States did not apply sanctions to Turkey when Turkey invaded Cyprus, did not apply sanctions to Israel when Israel invaded Lebanon, and certainly didn't apply sanctions to itself when it invaded Panama, or before that, of course, invasions of Southeast Asia. So there's something special about Kuwait. Most special about Kuwait, of course, has to do with oil, and should be recognized that what has driven American foreign policy ever since the end of World War II has been oil. Toward the end of World War II, President Roosevelt got together with Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, and essentially they just agreed that the United States would protect the rulers of Saudi Arabia, the rather draconian rulers of Saudi Arabia, and in return, the United States would essentially replace England as the dominant oil-controlling power in the Middle East. From that meeting stems this long period of American attempts to control the oil of the Middle East. And when they saw some of this control escaping from them with the invasion of Kuwait, and saw an opportunity, I think, to attack Iraq, which, after all, has one of the great oil reserves, and oil reserves not under the control of the West, but under the control of, yes, a dictator and a cruel dictator. But the important thing for the United States has never been the existence of a cruel dictator. The important thing for the United States has been, is this country independent of us or dependent on us? And the United States wants countries to be dependent on us, especially countries that are in charge of large stocks of oil. So, this is an important starting point to understand why the sanctions were put on specifically in this case, and why, from that point on, that is from August of 1990 to January 1991, the Bush administration, of course this was the elder Bush administration, was hell-bent on war. I mean, it was determined to make war on Iraq. It was not going to accept anything short of that. It was not going to accept a situation in which Iraq would be left in control, of its own oil resources. And so, despite the indications that sanctions were having an effect, a serious effect on Iraq, and despite the fact that there were a number of negotiating possibilities that opened up for settling the Kuwait dispute without going to war, the United States proceeded to get the Congress to approve a resolution giving Bush the power to make war, which he did. And I think the United States was determined, because of its Vietnam experience, to make this a short war, to put in overwhelming force, which it did when you consider that in a very short period it had over 500,000 troops in the area. It took several years, 3 years, before the United States had 500,000 troops in Vietnam. So the United States was determined, learning from Vietnam, determined that it should be a short war, determined that there would not be significant American casualties, and therefore it would be an air war, and ground troops would only be introduced, as in fact they were, only introduced if the way was totally clear, and if the victory was assured and there was no chance of significant casualties. And they learned also from Vietnam that if they were going to make war on Iraq, that the public would not know what was going on. The reporters would be kept from the scene. The damage that was to be done to Iraq, the damage to human beings, the killing of civilians, the destruction of the infrastructure of Iraq, all this would go on basically without American journalists in a position to check up on what was happening, and with the American journalists dependent on the briefings given to them by the Pentagon. So it was a very controlled war, a war which had been planned to meet certain criteria so that the public would not be aroused. If you have a 2-month or 3-month war, there's not enough time for a huge anti-war movement to develop. It took several years in the Vietnam era for a powerful anti-war movement to develop, and so the administration was very conscious of that. And so it proceeded to make this war. It was a cruel war. I remember, despite all the claims of the Pentagon that the United States was dropping smart bombs, of course it turned out later that only a percentage of these bombs were so-called smart, and most of them were quite dumb. And it also ought to be recognized that so-called smart bombs are put into motion by dumb people. And the result was a significant number of civilian casualties. To this day, we have no idea how many casualties there were. At the end of the Gulf War, reporters asked Colin Powell about American casualties. And he said very proudly that there were only a few hundred American casualties. And when a reporter asked Colin Powell, how about Iraqi casualties? Colin Powell replied, that's not a matter I am terribly concerned with. And in fact, the newspapers did not really report what was happening to people in Iraq, the suffering that was going on as a result of our bombing.